Presidenti. Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure and honor to, open this highlight of the Night of Architecture and to say a few words of welcome and on behalf of the Dutch Embassy, and also to introduce the guest speaker of tonight, Reinier de Graaf from OMA, the Netherlands. And since you are all students of architecture, I wonder whether I have to introduce to you at all the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, where Mr. de Graaf, Reinier de Graaf, works as partner, and since 2002 as director of AMO, the think tank of OMA. And as a Dutch diplomat, I'm quite familiar, I can say, with the buildings of OMA. I've lived in Utrecht and The Hague, and I visited the embassy in Berlin, which you've built, very beautiful building. And when I heard that Mr. de Graaf, who visited and worked in metropolitan cities like Hong Kong, London, Berlin, Hamburg, was coming to this metropolitan city of Bratislava, I was very, very proud, and I'm very happy that I can be here and listen to his speech tonight. And of course, Bratislava, I was joking a little bit. I really like the city. I'm living here for 4 years already, but to say that it's metropolitan is maybe a bit too much. And as you know, the trams in Bratislava say, welcome to the little big city of Bratislava. And actually, that is one of the reasons why I really like living here, because it's a very livable city. But I believe that the speech of Mr. de Graaf will touch upon, probably many issues of cities, contemporary cities, the problems that cities are facing due to congestion or sustainability issues. And Bratislava hasn't got that many of those problems yet, fortunately. But there are, of course, as you know much better than I do, the challenges from the, let's say, socialistic past. We have the suburbs of Karlova West, Petržalka, and there are also many issues of sustainability. And the Dutch embassy here in Slovakia, we really worked a lot with architects that focus also on green building or sustainability issues. And we have also sponsored events of the Slovak Green Building Council. Maybe you're familiar with it. What I also would like to mention before introducing the guest speaker, whom you're all awaiting, is a few words about the Dutch presidency in 2016 of the European Union. As you may know, we will be a president of the EU in 2016 and followed by Slovakia. And one of the themes that we'll be leading in our presidency, so the next half year of 2016, is the city. And we will do something very creative, which is also for students. There will be in Amsterdam, in Java Island, on the edge, the Kop from Java Island, we will have a pop-up creative campus. And here Dutch and European students can come together for 10 weeks. It will be in April till June. And they will have to find solutions for urban challenges of today and tomorrow. And not just any campus it will be off-grid. So if you would participate, you would have to create your own energy resource, you would have to get the water from the river Ij and grow your own food. So I hope you will survive if you would think to participate, but it will have to be very challenging and make you think about how can we live in a circular economy or circular terms. If this sounds interesting to you, please approach me afterwards, or Michala or Mark from our embassy, or have a look at our website if you would like to participate. So that's it from my part. I wish you a very inspiring, and I'm sure it will be a very interesting lecture from Reinier de Graaf. Enjoy.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Although it does urge me to apologize in advance that I will not be speaking about any of the subjects mentioned in this introduction. Also, thank you, Archtung, for inviting me. I'm very, very happy to be in Bratislava at this night of architecture. I haven't been here in a long time, and it's very nice to see the city after so long. Perhaps in an incredibly banal way, I would like to start this talk by presenting our company logo. Or actually what used to be our company logo. We don't really use this logo anymore. We use the acronym OMA, but I've always liked this logo because it, in a way, emphatically states our mission, Office for Metropolitan Architecture. And it also points out a very interesting history of the office. Many, or perhaps all of you will know, that our office didn't start with a building, but it started with a book by Rem Koolhaas, which from 1978, which celebrated the metropolitan condition, using New York as an example. Actually, believe it or not, at a time that it actually took some courage to celebrate the metropolitan condition. In the age of the megacity, with all the rhetoric of more than half of the world's population living in city, that's surprising now, but it wasn't then. And in many ways, this book is a kind of an early warning, to early 20th century warning of many of the things that happened to the world in the 21st century. Meanwhile, of course, the buildings we once wrote about, or he once wrote about in the book, are being built by us, and not just in New York. This is a building called the Rotterdam, which, surprise, surprise, is built in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. A sort of 21st aluminum version of the Rockefeller Center on a good day, I guess. Of course, building buildings also means that from a kind of an intellectual movement, you become a business. We, meanwhile, are a business with 5 offices worldwide, one on every continent. We do many projects on these continents, more than 80 projects in 35 countries. But in a way, none of this is interesting. What is interesting is not the fact that we work in the whole world. What is interesting is that the whole world works at us. Our office, our head office, there is about 350 staff, 45 nationalities. Our head office is in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands. Nevertheless, the Dutch are a minority. There is also that's a very interesting notion in contemporary Dutch politics, surely. But apart from the Dutch not being a majority, the essence is that there is no majority. That it's a series of small groups which in a way are all a minority. And this is not in a way to celebrate our office as the United Colors of Benetton. But there is a more interesting aspect to that. The very absence of a majority is the core of our creative formula, because with the absence of a majority, it also in a way means the absence of prejudice or any kind of culturally defined a priori in the face of any given problem. So in a way, if I were to describe the way we work, I would describe it as a permanent cultural clash, which we cultivate, hoping that from that clash, as some weird physical process, products emerge. So this is what it really looks like. The man here it's essentially a condition of doubt, where every idea is interrogated to the point that only the most robust ideas survive. It's a constant state of questioning, editing, overproducing, criticizing, and in a way a constant state of existential doubt. And here, the nice thing is that, in a way, the chief seems to be overcome by the sublime state of existential doubt, almost on a constant basis. But it is a way of working that leads to results. It leads to big results in interesting parts of the world. And working globally also means regularly making tough choices. This is the headquarters of China Central Television in Beijing, a commission we took on in 2002 when we had the choice either to work on ground zero or in China. Given the climate in America at the time, given the fact that we suspected this would become a very long and difficult talk show, we chose to move into China emphatically, but clearly not without risk. Clearly a political choice that is not without risk, one that we have sustained over time, but I think often the emphasis that the media have put on that political risk has in a way overshadowed another risk that in the contemporary world, architecture has become a very difficult thing to do. China Central Television wanted an icon, but today everybody wants an icon. So it's in a way a very interesting condition. This is a collage we made. This is not a real skyline, but it's a collage we made in the office of every single 21st century masterpiece, and there's a lot of them. But the strange thing is that if you look at another skyline, like for instance this one, which is made by offices completely unknown, completely anonymous, completely working in the absence of fame, often not even employing architects but engineer, truly this skyline is not that different. It also means that when everything is an icon, nothing is an icon. You have a cumulative excitement leads to a whole new form of boredom, where in a certain way, you need to single out our building with a red box on a screen to really notice it. Of course, most of this was done pre-2008, pre the financial crisis, and in a weird way, the financial crisis has shed a new light on this phenomena. Cctv for our office was in a way the outcome, let's say, of 30 years of existence of our office. Many projects done up to it, but it was completed in 2008 for the China Olympics, but we've done many projects since. To some extent, our office changed in that same period, from essentially being the office in a classical sense, dominated by one architect. It became a partnership. It became a collectively owned business, also to handle the vast volume of work in the world. And with that realization about the icon, also a new mandate. Please use 90 degrees angles only. Good luck, Rem. So the weird thing was that of course, the first chance to experiment with that new sobriety was actually in Dubai, in the Middle East, where by sheer miracle, we sort of discovered pleasure in a new type of architecture. Pleasure in an architecture that can look massive from one side, slender from the other side, and massive from the other side as well. The sublime embodiment of variety in a simple way. The facade of the building, of course, with pockets of resistance to the boring, as a kind of Vasarely painting. But what makes this building interesting is, of course, the context within which it is realized. Because, I mean, Dubai, as a city, in a way comes closest to the collage skyline we made earlier, to the caricature of a kind of cumulative excitement. And here, very effectively, when everything is exciting, something that is not becomes exciting. And it's an interesting full circle. So when we did this, we were very happy. The building never got built, so that didn't stop us turning our own building into a kind of branding campaign with stamps for Dubai, a kind of new type font in a Korean newspaper, etc., etc. This was all long after I think we heard we lost, as a kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome. But interestingly enough, the building, although unbuilt, became a kind of manifesto for work that followed. So this is our branded simplicity. It's in a way visible in other buildings. This is the Shenzhen Stock Exchange, but also in a building like the Rotterdam, which cumulatively may have an interesting shape, but every single component is rectangular, simplistic, and almost a pure typology of one of the functions it has. Again, a building that becomes interesting, not necessarily in photographs, but it becomes interesting by movement around it, passing around it, because it's a simple composition that allows a multiple of impression. It's got a strange relation between exterior and exterior, that in many parts of the building you look back, you look outside, but at the same time you look back at the building. So the building is a kind of the same and an other at the same time. And of course the facade is hugely beautiful by its sheer repetition. The interesting thing is that through very subtle variations, this is for instance a facade of the residential, where there is apartments behind, so is this is offices, further is hotel, and only through the most minimal technological variation do you actually read that. That has become a theme as well, which in a way is carried forward in other buildings. This is a recent project in London, south of the river Thames, where in a way, in another kind of high-rise context, we were meant to do initially a perimeter block, but with such demands on development quantum and quantity, that one of the first things we did was actually transform that essentially 19th century typology into a 20th century typology, extruded it and made this proposal. Again, something that excited us, not the twin, but the quadruple towers. But the interesting thing was that with the Rotterdam, this is of course a nice crossover between partially being a building and partially being a small urban plan, where in a way an urban condition and an architectural condition become the same. And hence, in a way, it's a building that constitutes a skyline in itself, and a skyline we can also vary, and we can particularly vary that in the case of demands like rights of light here, but also in the context in which the building is being built. This is a context where the vast majority of buildings that you see in the model are not there. They change every week, they change in height every week, and by, in a way, approaching our own building as a variable, flexible skyline, we could anticipate future changes of others. So it's an almost real-time thing, just going around it, conforming, being part, re-emerging again, and then sometimes looking as four separate buildings, sometimes actually looking as a single building. The interesting thing is, this is a project in London where housing prices are astronomical, which is only affordable increasingly only affordable to oligarchs and sheikhs. This was a project which was aggressively meant to be for low rent and affordable buyers schemes. A project with a public ground floor, permeable because all the four towers are essentially independent, as you can see here, with shops and a small office front on the ground floor. Residence amenities, compulsory in the British planning system, raised to a higher level to keep the ground floor public. And interestingly enough, although each tower in a way has different buyers and rental schemes, we minimized the difference in appearance to an extreme, so that you could not tell which part is social housing, which part is not. It's got a structure of balconies with a very, very thin steel frame that makes up the appearance, almost like a form of scaffolding around the building. So it's in a way a building that looks, even when finished, permanently under construction. The scaffolding is hung from the top, then goes down around the facade. Therefore, the steel can be extremely thin, almost like a wireframe, and then it keeps up these balconies. therefore, these four towers have a kind of open corners. The buildings overlap because the balconies overlap, and therefore you get this kind of strange moments of transparency in the short gaps between the buildings. There were some penthouses part of the program. We didn't make penthouses because in the context of something that's for most part social housing, we thought that would send a wrong signal. So therefore what we did do is make big apartments, but in a way make special apartments in the fact that they were not just in one tower, but that they straddled two towers. In a way had a double entrance, and they straddled two towers, as you can see here, two balconies, where there's also a condition that from your own apartment you actually look into your own apartment in a very interesting way. So it looks like a huge privacy violation, but actually the only privacy you violate is your own, which I guess is all right. It also momentarily disrupts, there's four of those apartments, they disrupt that whole system with a kind of weird cancerous exception. This is the building going up. You see the steel is deliberately painted in gold. Of course, also no coincidence for a project that for the vast majority is social rent. And all four roof gardens are actually for collective purposes and for everybody. So the top is not dedicated to penthouses, something private, but in each case the top of the buildings is something very public, as you can see here. And that's the building in its context, the kind of interesting wire-framed, never finished kind of animal. Blah, blah, blah. This is an older building, the same idea. It's a town hall in Rotterdam, but it's a town hall that could only fund itself by, in fact, being something like 60% apartments on the top. They are starters apartments, so they're also apartments offered for small apartments for low prices. This is an initial rendering of the building. It contains the offices of the town hall on the lower floors. On the top floors, that same mass contains apartments, and it hovers like a cloud over the ground floor where actually the public facilities of the town hall are. So that's the rendering. That's meanwhile the state of the work. Well on the way, nearly finished. Here you see the whole idea that there's actually small apartments. Each apartment has a terrace of about 50 square meters, and sometimes the terrace is as big as the apartment itself, which interestingly means that you live in a small apartment in the middle of the city, but you nevertheless have the feeling of a house and a garden on the 20th floor of the building. That's it. It will be ready in December. It will have an opening in December, so it's well on the way. There's these terraces which hopefully will provoke whoever lives there to take these tiles out as soon as possible and do something vaguely more interesting. It's an apartment here, the terrace of the view. This is one of the atriums in the building where you look down. It's a very deep building. It needs two atriums to shed light on the lower office floors. These atriums, in a way, preserve the whole steel structure that the building is built on, because this is the original idea of the building. It's essentially a steel structure which is composed of a limited number of elements, basically 4 elements, which like a kind of meccano you assemble. One of the important things of this building that it can be built extremely fast, but it can be taken apart even faster. That gave us a great deal of sustainability points, because when you actually erect the building like a tent, when you take it apart like a tent, you have no building waste, but you end up with the same spare parts that you started it when you built it. And in theory, you could take the parts, ship them, and build another building with it. Pretty much what they do with, that is sustainability, yeah. Wow. But pretty much what they're doing to East German Plattenbau at the moment, taking it apart and reconstructing it elsewhere. So that's then the whole thing built with a kind of technical drawing. And this is a photo of one of the atriums with the camera rotated, where there is a kind of, it's a light well, and at the same time it's a kind of spectacle of steel, a kind of 21st century Eisenman in the atrium. That's the cladding of the ground floor, which is meanwhile going into place, which will essentially cover this space here, make it an interior space, the public space of the town hall, and that's the building in the city. Rotterdam is a mess. That's the essence of Rotterdam. It was bombed during the war, and it's had about 5 or 6 revisionist styles in its reconstruction, and in a way, the somewhat messy appearance of our building fits quite nicely in a city without any architectural consensus. This is the Markthal. Another building, a more recent building, again affordable housing in Stockholm. An interesting situation where where a city architect had in a way designed a building. I don't know whether that's the job of city architects necessarily, but anyway he had, which was a kind of church organ shaped building, supposedly a gate to Stockholm. This shape was legally fixed, and we chose to inhabit that space incredibly obediently, in an extremely obedient manner, in the sense that we didn't go outside the shape, but we made a type of architecture which was completely different than the type of architecture its initial creator had in mind. So it's a strange mix between formal obedience to the letter, but disobedience in spirit, which we increasingly find a more productive way to work. So that's the buildings, 35-story towers. It freezes in Sweden, still gets very cold. So therefore the whole building is prefabricated, even in terms of its primary, secondary and tertiary structure. It's almost of an former East German efficiency in its construction. Those are the skyboxes. And then it's an alternation of skyboxes and balconies, the two elements which on the whole make up the appearance of those buildings. Large balconies, small apartments, again. The whole building is modern, but at the same time it's brown, in the sense that this is a building where we use hammered concrete facade panels for its expression. It's in a way the vast majority of the neighborhood is either brown stucco or brick, but this is a kind of concrete that mimics that brown. So it's a series of examples of the facade, a ribbed panel, and a panel that in a way is hammered down to become hammered concrete. This is illegal. Since the days of Paul Rudolph and the Barbican, this is not used anymore, but more recently, the same thing can be done with a machine, which means that in the context of contemporary labor laws, it's a kind of an appearance you can produce without violating labor laws. So that's the concrete hammered down. It's very interesting that when you look at it straight, it's a kind of a hatch, but once you start looking at it under an angle, it almost becomes like a rock. So the building is deliberately very, very rough in its appearance. And there you go. So that's the hammered concrete. Balcony, living room, balcony, living room, balcony, living room, balcony, living room, balcony, etc., etc., etc. This is the lobby, where essentially the same structure is carried through all the way to the ground floor. Behind the lobby there is a big wall of melted glass as a kind of an ornament, very light, bright material on the inside, made with an interesting chemical procedure. And there is the ground floor. This building will commence construction in July this year. The last project I would like to show, before I start talking about other things, is a project we didn't win. it was a competition for a bridge across the Thames, again in London. And of course, in the 21st century, bridges are no longer a means to get the shortest crossing from A to B. Bridges are icons. So this is a competitor. There's another competitor. This is just to give an idea of the general production of how complex you can make a journey from A to B. This is another one. This is another one. This is a stand. And it's very interesting. So this is proposed for London. Now, London has a very, very delightful aspect to it. It's got the most cynical press, the most cynical media, probably in the entire world. So this is a website, a populist website, Citymetric, that in a way evaluated this competition. It was a public competition. They had a site, the 12 most ridiculous designs for the new Battersea Bridge. So there we go. The one that is a scribble, no idea, literally none. The one with segregation, cyclists and pedestrians kept apart. There should be something oddly touching about those people desperately trying to scale the wall, though. Here we go. We get it. It's so the cyclists don't have to carry their bikes down the step, but it just looks silly. The one's a circle, because why cross a river directly when you can go on a 200-meter diversion? And here, we're pretty sure this is the intro to the mid-noughties Ed Sheeran song. The one inspired by Windows Media Visualizations. And the one with all the fairy lights. How can we spice this up? Let's cover it good in like the room of an 18-year-old university student on a budget. And then here, the one that could water your lawn is the Millennium Bridge with sprinklers. A touching tribute, the one that's a spoon, a touching tribute to London's culinary culture. And then number 2, the one like a nightmarish Escher painting. Where does the floor end? Where do the stairs go? Why are the people so small? Why are the leaves transparent? Are those boys about to drown? This is MVRDV, by the way. So this is afterwards, but because we suspected what would happen, we opted for a different approach, kind of a single Vierendeel truss, crossing the river, shortest point from A to B, with cyclists and pedestrians on either side, so not a double bridge, but just a single beam, almost like the beam of a building, a steel beam with a crossing on and off, that in the context of London would look like a series of white picture frames framing the city, a kind of a monument to simplicity, and in a way a monument, the anti-icon, which of course in a weird way is also an icon. But so, strangely enough, that although the approach was completely opposite, this made us the number 1 of that website. The one which is definitely not a bridge. Helpful tip for architects. You can't just draw squares on a photo and call it a design. Yeah. Anyway, so where does this get us? I mean, that's the real thing. So sort of like 7-8 years ago, we thought we reinvented simplicity, we would conquer the world, but things are not quite that simple. You know, this building, last week I on one of my travels, I was thinking of this building, and I encountered this building. This is the holiday, well, the former holiday in Beirut. Sort of, well, yeah. It still has the bullet holes and all the remnants of course, the civil war. This is a pro-Palestinian fighter with a photo of Nasser in that same building. It was a building that during the civil war in Lebanon was fought over room by room, corridor by corridor, space by space. It's never been reconstructed, and in a way it stands not as a building, but always as a memorial to a particular period in Beirut. You can see it in the city here. Here's hotels. Meanwhile, new buildings going up. But still, the largest, most monumental building is in a way a building that's no longer a building. On the other side of the street, a building of Herzog and Dameron goes up. Very interesting kind of contrast, where in a way an old icon is accommodated by a new icon. And I have, thinking about our tasks, because I mean, I don't want to bitch necessarily about colleagues. I mean, we could have been in the same situation here, but it's a very mysterious context. This is the 20th century, this is the 21st century. They're both examples of modern architecture, but something very, very fundamentally has changed. Presented in the press with a lot of advertisement, modern architecture, but at the same time the type of architecture that contributes to a trend where nobody can live in the center of Beirut anymore. Phenomenally expensive apartments, an apartment with essentially 30 stories of penthouses. And it's a very strange thing that if you think at one point the mission of modern architecture was to make affordable spaces available to as many people as possible, that somehow that same language of efficiency, minimalism and abstraction currently serves the completely opposite person, that it's become complicit, no matter how you design, no matter what you design, in a kind of process which is fundamentally anti-modern, which is fundamentally exclusive. So that is something I think for all of us to think about, because it simply moves beyond the stylistic considerations that mostly architects have. It's also part, of course, not just of Beirut, of an international trend. So this is the terraces by Herzog and Dameron in Beirut. This is their building in New York. This is again another version in China. This is currently happening anywhere. And this complicitness of modern architecture, unwittingly, is slowly but surely giving modern architecture a bad name. This is a recent quote from the Chinese president about freaky or weird buildings. Architecture should be, excuse the prose, should be like sunshine from the blue sky and the breeze in spring that will inspire minds, warm hearts, cultivate taste, and clean up undesirable work styles, which in a way, I mean, translating this kind of prose simply is a protest against waste. But I think it's also a protest against the fact that architecture today seems to serve the cause of few rather than of many, which of course in a country that is still communist is inherently problematic. And there was a strange echo between, in a way, this rhetoric and the speech I found from 1954 of Nikita Khrushchev, when he, in a way, vilified the Stalinist period in the Soviet Union in favor of cheaper, better, faster manifesto. I'd like to end on a little bit of an analysis of that situation and make an excursion not to architecture but to an economist, Thomas Piketty, who about a year ago wrote the book Capital in the 21st Century, a French economist with most of his career spent in the US, who has got a very shockingly simple analysis. In fact, it's an analysis that is so simple that you wonder why no economist has brought it up before. What he compares is the financial returns on labor vis-à-vis the financial return on capital. In other words, how much money do you make by working? How much money do you make by simply having money? And as soon as you make more money by having money than you can ever do by working, of course, inequality in society inevitably rises, because no matter how hard you work, how hard you slave, you can never catch up with somebody who already has possessions. So the interesting thing about his book is that he's done a very long historical analysis of the two, of the return on capital and the return on labor, tracking them basically since the beginning of times and making an extrapolation into the mid-century of this century. What he's found, interestingly enough, is that the 20th century was a brief exception, where the returns on labor, where you made more money from working than you did from having money. That is also the period of the great social mobility. That is also the period running roughly from 1914 till the end of the 80s. That is also the period in which, interestingly enough, architecture formulated all its utopias, formulated all its socialist cities, formulated all its mass housing projects, and in a way architecture had an ideological, idealist mission. If you take his timeline, his economic timeline, and you put the titles of architectural manifestos, you see that it's neatly framed. In the 1970s, for the first time, the income on labor starts to drop in favor of that of capital. Strangely enough, that coincides with a weird moment of crisis. This is Pruitt-Igoe in the United States. Pruitt-Igoe is by architecture in 1972. The demolition of a social housing project, which was not even 18 years old at the time, because of crime, vandalism, and poverty, has often, particularly by American critics like Charles Jenks, been heralded as the bankruptcy, as the end of modern architecture. The demolition of this essentially modernist housing estate in 1972, in a way, created a shift in the profession, a diminished confidence, where an increasing amount of architects started to write, reflect, instead of to propose blueprints and aggressively build. And also here, you see that essentially that trend fills up the remaining gap. So if you zoom out again, you see that also that way of thinking in architecture, like the status of the economy, might be nothing but a brief exception in the history of man. A period that runs from 1914 to 1989, from the shot in Sarajevo, the beginning of World War I, to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, also when there were no longer two systems globally to keep each other in check. The most important architectural manifesto of 1914 was the Futurist Manifesto by Thomas Filippo Marinetti. Interestingly, the most important architectural book of 1989 is A Vision of Britain by Prince Charles. A British royal that essentially ends a modern age. In a way, from the bloody uniform of Franz Ferdinand to the decorated uniform of the Prince of Wales. Strangely enough, that means you go from aristocracy to aristocracy. And the thought starts to dawn that maybe the 20th century simply didn't take place. Maybe it's nothing but a brief interruption of an other continuum that seems to dominate our existence. A continuum goes from one man to another, almost to a kind of interesting merger. Both men, incidentally, both Franz Ferdinand and Prince Charles had a passion for architecture. This is the Belvedere, that is Buckingham Palace. So here we go from the 19 right into the 21st century. And whoever thinks that I'm exaggerating, which of course I am, but to anyway momentarily dissuade that thought, these are the grand housing estates everywhere in Europe of the 20th century, all social housing estates. The vast majority are either being demolished, have been demolished, or are about to be demolished. This is part of an investigation of mine for a book which is called The Century That Never Happened. But interestingly enough, so the 20th century is a brief illusion. It's also the age in which most of us were raised. It's also the age in which most of our value systems are built. If it is a brief interception, we know what we had before. What will we have after? And here, an interesting thing reoccurs. This is Le Corbusier in 1925, Plan Voisin, a fragment of La Ville Radieuse, the ideal modern socialist city. This is a more recent city plan. It's a plan for Mumbai. Interestingly enough, it almost looks similar. I mean, it's got a slightly more varied skyline, etc., but it's got high-rise buildings, it's got central cores, it's got a grid of street, it's got all the features of this. Nevertheless, this was not made by an architect. This was a report made by McKinsey, who apparently does city planning these days in Mumbai, where this city had an ideological ambition. This is the same technical repertoire stripped from its ideological dimension, a profit-driven repertoire where the money that is saved is not invested in any social aim, but simply forgotten. So this is the ideal we all aspire to, the urban ideal, but invariably today that ideal comes in tandem with this. The ideal of the high-rise comes in tandem with this. The suburb comes in tandem with that. This is the American-Mexican border. And it's very interesting that 25 years after the demolition of this wall, which was supposed to make the whole world one, supposed to be the beginning of a new era of progress, that somehow this wall is gone, but that wall is there, and etc. All kinds of other intangible walls are being built. Sorry. So 25 years ago, the Berlin Wall fell. That was celebrated last November. At the time, the political situation in the world was like this. Red, essentially a standoff between two major blocs, one of which supposedly democratic, the other one communist. This is the political situation today. It's very interesting. Blue are democracies. There you have elections. Red are, well, non-democracy. I guess you could call them dictatorships. There you don't have election. But there's an increasingly successful category, which is the yellow, which is countries where you have elections, but you know the outcome in advance. A very, very manageable system, what Vladislav Surkov refers to as managed democracy. And strangely enough, a context in which most contemporary architects love to work. This is a quote from Foster or Rogers, can't remember who, simply complaining about how long it takes to get a single airline terminal built in the West, Terminal 5 at Heathrow, comparing it to China, where they simply get on with it. We're in a state of denial, while they, the Chinese, are making decisions in the spirit of the Victorians. They have the courage to try it. That's Norman Foster. I don't know who this is. What attracts me about China is that there's still a state, something, and a kind of an admiration of the decisiveness. But at what cost? The more centralized the power, the less compromises need to be made in architecture. The directions are clearer. Peter Eisenman. Democracy obviously is something we don't want to get rid of, but it does create chaos. I mean, it means the guy next door can do whatever he wants. Creates a collision of thinking of all people. Yeah? In cities, that means people build whatever they want. Some of the most amazing places were built because of dictator. Architecture is always related to power, related to large changes, whether financial or Bernard Tschumi. And this one is priceless. I think the best thing to have is a benevolent dictator with taste. What it leads to, I mean, if that's the general attitude, what you could extrapolate as an outcome is that in 1989, we thought it was only a matter of time before the whole world would be blue, i.e. democratic. What might be the case is that the whole world doesn't become blue nor red, which for a long time it looked like in the 20th century, but actually becomes yellow. You know, a universal, managed, controlled, money-driven, self-interested constellation of political system, and the question remains, would we still say yes? Thank you. In complete architects, in complete spirit of the last chapter, I'm not prepared to answer any questions. No, but in case there are questions, do we have time?
Yes, we do.
Oh.
Check. Yeah, wonderful. Does any one of you have a question? I'm sure you do. Don't be shy. Okay, Yufei, wonderful.
Oh, hello. Yeah, thanks for the lecture. I just want to ask, you mentioned this profit-driven approach to architecture and this era of capitalism, but you also mentioned this era in the 20th century where the architects did manifestos and approach to a very social-based architecture. But do you see the problem that the role of architects, which were before really in the center of the society and have this vision and ideas how they try to make the society and others things and make interventions, but nowadays the political role or the power of architects gets declined, it gets less and less, and the city are simply produced by politicians and some other actors. And you, so what it's now actually do you see the mission of ours? It's engage politically or try to make better designs, but within a certain frame.
Now, I'm not sure if what I see as the mission of architects in a changed context. Is that your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Now, I basically think, you know, you should also not overestimate essentially the mission of architects in the 20th century, because surely as politicians are deciding cities' fates now, they were deciding cities' fates then. What has changed a lot is that for a long time architects worked much more for the public sector. The amount of commissions of somebody like Le Corbusier or any of the people you showed in terms of public commissions was a way larger form of his portfolio than even with a practice like ours, where in the context of the market economy, you represent private interests more often than you represent public interests. I think the problem with architecture as a whole is that architecture has simply failed to recognize this. Many architects think when they continue to do buildings that look modern, they're serving the same cause as the modernists served when they were building modern buildings. However, with a change in context, those buildings today almost serve an opposite aim. That's what I was trying to tell. And I think, what I think is inevitable, that since architects do not work in the public sphere anymore, that inevitably a certain amount of political responsibility starts to fall on architects in terms of what choices they make, who they work for, what they do, and in a way almost start to interfere in the financial economy as part of the design of their whole projects, because otherwise you simply become a pawn with interests that are defined elsewhere. And what I'm trying to do with this talk is in a way put a first step in creating this awareness, because it's a phenomena that affects us as much as it affects everybody else. So this is primarily a kind of wake-up call with hopefully more concrete and productive strategies to follow in its wake.
It's getting about to get a bit heavy, I guess. Any more questions? Come on, give me more. Wonderful. I knew that.
Yeah, well, I got a more of a stylistic question. From the projects that I've seen, most of them really looked like, I don't know, I would say Chicago school, like from like the way you're building or designing buildings still seem to embrace certain repetitiveness that I've seen before. Is still all of these projects, they were, as you were saying, for poor people. Well, socially.
Well, I didn't say poor people.
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
I think that's a gross...
I'm sorry.
I think it was slightly more subtle.
Yeah.
At least I was aware of who they were for.
That's my fault. But my question is this really still an issue, like building modern style buildings for the poor in 21st century? Do you get me what I mean?
No, I think I do get what you mean. I think it's an issue like never before. And also, because I thought about it long, you know, when you build efficient buildings and the costs you save go into the profits of few, I mean, a potentially very interesting form of resistance could be to build wasteful buildings, because then at least the money goes into the concrete and not into the hands of those that you don't want. But I don't think that's ultimately an answer. I mean, I do, in a way, believe in some of the ethos of modern architecture, which in a way is still a period I think we are in many ways, because all the rationale points in that direction. I think it is simply about additional responsibilities, trying to ensure that the results of that efficiency, the results of that rationalization, end up as a benefit for a larger number of people, for the right people. I mean, that's it. And that's, and then as much as Chicago school, I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks.
If you say one of the most important things is that a big mass of people has a benefit from the architecture, how goes that together with building for CCTV?
Well, CCTV is a state television operation, and I don't know if you know the building CCTV inhabited before it inhabited our buildings. It's a drastically different building. It's a building that was closed off from the public, was a complete kind of fortress. And one of the things we have done in the context of CCTV, in as much as this is of course possible in the Chinese system, but what we have done is that shape is actually not a wanton shape. That shape is a loop, which is also a public trajectory that goes through all the departments of the building, which is accessible to the public. So therefore what we did try to do with CCTV was also make the whole machinations of Chinese media and state television accessible to the public. Whether we succeeded or therefore structurally changed the system with such a building, I don't know. But it was, in terms of its intentions, consistent with some of the aims I've stated. And there's very many Chinese people, so in that sense the largest number.
My question is, should architects take part in competitions and in design in countries which, well, how to say it, don't really treat their citizens very nicely?
Yeah, but I mean that, yes. But of course, it's you have to be very careful not to kind of be blanket, because I mean there are citizens treated very unfairly in a great many more countries than the countries the West likes to brand as irresponsible. And in terms of accepting or rejecting commissions in our office, we really go, we assess on a case-by-case basis. We've always declined any kind of categorical black spots. And I think essentially that's a smart thing.
Any more questions? Okay.
Hello. I have a question. Like when you design from the project that you design in very big scale, and when you think of such a big scale, you still have the user. And do you think of the user as the individual human being, or is there, or do you forget it? Like, how do you keep the small scale that actually the people come to touch with when you design in such large scale?
Well, we also design very small buildings. We even design furniture. I personally somehow ended up doing very big projects. I don't know how that happened, but I mean, I impartially show projects that I'm responsible for in the context of the office. But of course, every big scale ultimately has a small scale. And every collective, every mass is essentially ultimately a sum total of individuals. And it's not that our office has, just as we don't single out countries where we work or do not work, we've also never singled out a scale. We have done furniture, bus stops, individual homes, and these very large buildings. And I'm also sure that in working on these large buildings, once you get down to the detail and once you get down to individual apartments, etc., our work in projects on the small scale informs the projects in a sensible way. So we do our best, I guess, is my answer.
Any?
Are you planning on having any projects in Slovakia or Bratislava?
Well, I mean, you don't plan to have projects anywhere. I mean, the essence of an architect is that people plan to have you, or they don't. So, but I mean, we'd certainly be open to, of course, build projects in Slovakia. We could imagine worse places.
Anyone bold enough to ask another question, or are we done? The last question that is available. Okay.
Thank you. Just a really simple question, I suppose. You said, well, at the very beginning of your lecture, you said that you came back to Bratislava, and just when was the last time you were here, and sort of your impressions and contrast?
First time I came was when...
Thank you.
The first time when I came was kind of on a romantic sort of honeymoon where we cycled from Vienna to Bratislava and ultimately on to Budapest. That was 1997. And then I've been back on a brief visit, I think somewhere early in the noughties. But that's quite a long time ago, and it feels different, I have to say. I don't know why. There's new buildings, but there is a different kind of atmosphere than what I remember, and particularly the distinction cycling in from Austria into Slovakia the border is a lot fuzzier, and so. Can we have a drink?
I'm sure we can. Thank you for coming, Mr. de Graaf, and thank you for you all to come to this lecture. It has been a tremendous experience, especially mentioning the Piketty's Capital. You were probably the first one mentioning this important book on this university, actually, I suppose. And like I said, on the behalf of the whole organization team, on the behalf of the students and university, we thank you for having you here on this university, and we'll see you on the beer, I guess.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.